the event has been described as thus. Karrabing Film Collective upends the customary artist talk in which an artist shares their knowledge, followed by questions from an audience to the artist. Karrabing members instead redirect their own questions to the audience, playing with dialectical reversal and the politics of their reception as Indigenous artists, and making visible the gallery, cinema, and classroom as a field of power. So what does this mean exactly? We organized this artist talk in a somewhat unconventional format in response to discussions between myself and the artist, but also in a longer running discussion in the critical and discursive reception of their work. This happens in the pages of art publications, in academic journals, but also during public talks in museums, film festivals, and universities all over the world. And in our discussions and in these pages of text, we picked up on a thread that appears from time to time in conversation with members of Karrabing, and also in the writings by one of its members, Elizabeth Povinelli, a very celebrated anthropologist based in New York, but who also spends much of her time in the Northern Territories. And in this thread, Karrabing, often reflects on the politics of their reception as Indigenous artists and the various interpretations of their work. This feedback loop appears in print as well as in live discussion. So for those of you who have seen the 6 short films displayed on the 2 monitors in the gallery or in the virtual screening series, How We Make Karrabing, the artists have already tried to answer our usual questions of who are you? What are your films about? How do you make these films? And most often and most importantly, why do you make these films? Or perhaps you've seen one of the 7 featured films in the cinema space of the gallery or in the 2 virtual screening series that have passed, and you're probably still left with many questions. While the intoxicating combination of actors, images, places, and times as temporal and ontological juxtapositions on the screen may provoke some unease and risk misunderstanding, this is indeed partly their intention. As hard as we may try to comprehend the filmmaker's context and convert the dialogue and text into another language, Karrabing films resist easy cross-cultural translation and require us, presumably the non-Indigenous viewer, to experience our own disorientation, the disruptions of place and time that are usually thrust upon Indigenous subjects, leaving us to wonder about the characters and stories portrayed, and perhaps most importantly about ourselves. What am I looking at? Where am I looking at? And when am I looking at? They are trying to reverse the direction of disruption of social ease. Disorientation and mistranslation are key methods of Karrabing films, as well as their own form of meaning. But then for the somewhat initiated, and I'm assuming that that's most of us here, the liberal, educated global audience that has already been trained with a certain understanding about Indigenous existence, these efforts by Karrabing are met with an equal desire to approximate and understand Indigenous knowledge with concepts that are endogenous or familiar to our own world. And I think actually Povinelli, along with one of their longtime collaborators, Tess Leah, said this best in another reflection on this politics of their reception in 2018, when they wrote, whenever, and I quote, "Whenever Karrabing members are present for questions after viewings, whether in Berlin, Jerusalem, Athens, or Canberra, audiences attempt to pin the meaning of what they are seeing to gain a better account of Karrabing intentions. The questions are usually provocative, genuine, and probative, invoking laughter, discussion, and interaction. And as such, they're not wrong questions. They are also still indicative of a field of power in the kindly quest for meaning, a subtle and well-intentioned semantic plea. But for it is in this play between the conditioned expectations and what Karrabing members want to say about who they are that all Karrabing films make visible. So we're going to have a bit of a meta discussion here. It's not a coincidence that the global popularity of Karrabing Film Collective all over the world in museums and film festivals and universities rose with the emergence of what's been called the post-human turn in the humanities and social sciences, an ontological and epistemological decentering of the human in our understandings of the world. Since the late 1990s, the humanities and social sciences have been undergoing a paradigm shift caused by declining post-structuralist influence and the end of postmodernism. So new theoretical tools to redress the massively distributed and networked planetary problems generated by global capitalism, migration, ecological crises, technological advancement, and so forth. And this shift attempts to build a more holistic and inclusive system of knowledge and alternative ways of knowing, combining the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences with indigenous knowledges and indigenous ways of knowing. Moreover, the work of Karrabing has also been received as evidence of a similar paradigm shift happening in the art industry. For example, in a 2019 review of a survey by the collective at MoMA PS1 in New York stated, we've entered a precarious state for our species and planet. We can see with every hurricane or political or economic crisis that the world has entered permanent glitch mode. Indigenous Australians are in that sense the avant-garde of our species. The avant-garde of our species. The Karrabing Collective convey that knowledge and experience with a quiet and sure confidence, showing us how their violently altered world has become our world too. It has also recently been said that Karrabing films and installations work with and against Western genres inside art and university worlds. But if we are meeting this paradigm shift and watching the films of Karrabing and discussing them together, are they still able to work against such expectations? So it's against this background that Karrabing rose to prominence, and yet this shift seems to threaten their initial intentions of disorientation and mistranslation. To smooth over their work as now recognizable forms and recognizable content that resemble what is being theorized by avant-garde academia and the culture industry. So as their work continues to circulate globally, the question emerges, who resembles whom? Is it possible that will remain in the dialectic articulated in 1965 by Ousmane Sembene, a Senegalese filmmaker of third cinema, when he spoke to the French filmmaker and pioneer of visual anthropology, Jean Rouch, you look at us as if we were insects. And in this sense, the problem of showing oneself for the other and of representing the other simply to represent ourselves, i.e. the non-Indigenous audience, remains. One Karrabing member frames the question again another way as part of a long history of theft, the theft of knowledge in the colonized world. The making of the film is a reiteration of the content of the film. As we tell a story about a group being diverted from the path of settler property to the path of an ancestral group of dogs made, she's referring to their first film, When the Dogs Talked, in 2014. Karrabing is enacting this very diversion. So the question is, how do they do both when the content of the films can also be a vehicle for counter diversion into machinery of cultural capital? How do they show something for each other without giving it away to anyone? All Karrabing films must grapple with a specific problem about how to orient its land and artistic practice within and against this unrelenting history of knowledge extraction, abstraction, and circulation that moves value out of and away from its purpose, namely the strengthening of human obligations to the ancestral present. This, the strengthening of human obligations to the ancestral present, is the ultimate answer to the question, why do you make your films? And in this sense, even though our conversations about the relevance of Karrabing films to recent philosophical and critical approaches to nature and ontology might be interesting for us here, and they have been useful to some members, if only to make more clear which conversations they wish to be part of and which they'd prefer not to. They are, these topics and relevance, and I quote, of little interest to us. So on the occasion of this exhibition and the ICA's broader artistic research program, inquiring into other knowledges and with other ways of knowing, we thought we might try to experiment with the traditional artist talk by reversing the direction of inquiry. Karrabing will instead ask us, the global and local to Shanghai audience, questions that are of interest to them. So while in normal times we would have hosted the artists here in person in Shanghai, and during the time of COVID, we would have hosted this talk remotely online, synchronously. However, due to time zone differences and a lack of reliable Wi-Fi in their current location, a live synchronous event was not possible. Therefore, Karrabing members Gavin and Cameron Bianamu and Elizabeth Povinelli will ask their questions for us in a pre-recorded video, which we will screen next. And then afterwards, we invite you to respond to their questions in a discussion. And then after this event, we'll share the recorded discussion with the artists. Just a bit of more background. Karrabing similarly participated in an asynchronous virtual artist talk like this at another university this time last year, still in the throes of COVID, in which questions from the audience were gathered and sent to the artist, who then responded in a recorded video while taking a break from road building out at Bamayak. This was partly our inspiration also for experimenting with today's format. And one last thing I'll say, and perhaps we can chew on as we're, reflecting on the questions and reflecting on the method or the format of today. This method we're trying to employ here is a manifestation of how they make their films, a reiteration of content, as was mentioned earlier. They shoot their scenes whenever the time or place feels right, people are around, iPhones are charged. And in this kind of, ad hoc manner of producing and responding and discussing, they resist the disciplinary logic of filmmaking and the professional expectations of the culture industry. So we, the ICA with Karrabing Film Collective, therefore hope that you'll join us in this earnest experiment and endeavor with us to enact another diversion. I think we can start the film now.
Hello people from China, hope you might enjoy Karrabing Film Collective movie. Each film we made, it got a story beside it.
Take on the young people and all there, they come to the island. The guy we need to the water all. See my mermaid. They got all the dam, the balloon, all the cave, all the mermaids that take with them kid, a young kid, the island now. One woman in Silicon, no long in a woman. Long time ago, when he was a young boy, that woman be one of my food. Maybe a man bring him a drum. When we come back now, Mokubin, blame Mokubin, well, or damn, let me dive into the water, oh. And true.
Is that true?
Bullshit. Bullshit that story you listen to. That one that was experiment like this my woman that tell me that mud that kalangat in it. So they can change that kid and suck him to let dry. Well, ending slowly by slowly, pieces by pieces. Day after day, month after month, year after year. You can sense it, through the bush where we're walking through, you feel it yourself, you egg it up.
Look at that jump mermaid there. What did I get there? Water.
And maybe Cameron could say just a little bit about what we make these films for.
It's for my ancestors passed to the next generation. We tell the story
From grandmothers passed down to the next, to the present, and the future. Children are growing up now.
Cool.
So we know how to look after our country, how to manage it. Yeah.
And you guys, you two are a part of a group that working on that rock fish trap.
yes.
Yes, it was.
And maybe try explain like that thing what it look like.
Fish trap. It's
With rocks.
with rocks. People been gathering
Our
it,
ancestors was
making
gathering
it
it.
a big long
a big
Like
round
a-
circle.
pool. When the tide eventually go out, it's like make fish get trapped in a small pool, but some pool can be larger. Yeah, like pretty long. Some they are, some very small, just like very close distance, just to walk, to collect food and all that. It's been there for thousands of generations.
And you reckon we human ancestors would make that?
Yes.
But we got other kind of ancestors in that area, like Dolk.
Yeah.
Yes, we got
totem.
Along the coastline. Well, all the family in the film are connected through the totem and through the sea, even the inland.
We jump in here, damn, we got a tunnel, we swim, come on, down the
You
island.
gotta be fucking kidding me. 300 fucking kilometers underground, we might fucking drown there
You
halfway.
Calvin, you muddy, you can swim. You Gavin, you dulk, you can swim like me. Come on.
Fucking hell. Come on, Gav, we just do it.
Nah, we're gonna die halfway in the underground. guys have totem in your country?
How do you guys look after your land?
Right.
And you guys, do you have totem too?
Do you guys have traditional rights like to own your land? How does it go? What's the law it's like down there? Can you please give us information?
Do.
Some government people trying to claim our land, but here in Australia, in Northern Territory, we got Aboriginal claim, land claim.
What you want to ask him in?
Just give us a feedback about our film, and we want to know how you guys, if you guys like it or dislike it. Just give us a bit of feedback. That's all we want to know.
Okay. So I apologize if the quality of the video was a bit shoddy, but we have provided a link in the chat for those of you that would like to watch the video again in YouTube. And that might give you a better sense of the flow of the video. But we've also repeated the questions in the following slides. So if we could just start with the first question, please. There were a couple of questions, or I think about 5 in total, that were asked. And at the very end, they asked sort of the most obvious one, which is asking for feedback on their films, and this seems to be the most comfortable place to start, hopefully. Why don't we begin with that question? Next slide. Just feedback about our films. What is it that we would like to feedback to the artists about their films? And feel free to enter your questions into the chat, or you can just turn off or turn on your microphone or video, and we'll look out for the responses there. Could we go back to the first slide, actually? And these can be questions as well. We're not forbidden from asking questions to the artists. Can I call upon a few people that I know here today that I feel would have a very specific perspective, perhaps a few of the filmmakers or artists that are in the room that have their own filmmaking practice, perhaps Mao Laoshe or Xin Hao, if either of you would like to, or a thumbs up, that's also a good response as well. Any kind of feedback or even questions that you would redirect about the films. Yes, please do.
大家好，我是喜安，然后我现在在上海，然后我觉得可能因为我昨天也在一场 crit 里面，然后大家也不太想要直接的给反馈，我就觉得也许可以先从就间接的反馈开始吧。然后一开始看到这些问题， 我觉得有一个点就是说，它会涉及的就不只是直接的反馈，它会，我觉得他们就卡拉宾的项目，它其实会涉及一些问题是你是谁，然后你从哪里来，然后其实我自己看卡拉宾小组最深的感触，其实除了去欣赏他们的电影外，我觉得点就是你会一直很好奇，Elizabeth 的这个认识过程，就是因为我们知道卡拉宾他其实是除了一群他是不固定的班子嘛，然后是澳洲的原住民，然后但是他们也不是同一个部落的，他们是2个部落，然后他们是比较近的关系，所以其实是一个很有机的，就是在一次08年的暴乱以后，就是他们就是有一些社会事件，然后他们才组合在一起。然后呢，那 Elizabeth Povinelli 她是一个美国白人，然后是意大利移民，所以然后他是一个人类学家。其实我觉得，因为历史上就是这种白人人类学家，或者说是日本人类学家，之于譬如说台湾的原住民，或者是其他的非白人的原住民，一直都有这种比较奇特的关系嘛，就是说一个是被研究的，一个是研究者，然后代表了譬如说帝国等等。我其实个人最感兴趣的其实是 Elizabeth 她整个的历程，因为其实你在一些访谈里面也可以看到 Elizabeth 她会说，她开始去 pick up，就是捡起她的家族的图腾啊，可能要找到，因为欧洲的原住民，那你就要找到11世纪、14世纪，就是在宗教清洗以前。对，所以其实它是一个很动态的过程。然后，所以我其实自己，我分享一个点，就是我看到这些问题的时候，很多问题我觉得我不能回答，因为我自己是，我是台湾的汉人嘛，然后你其实很难说，就是我们有什么样的维持土地的，总之我们家是公务员，然后这跟土地几乎是没有关系。然后，其实我那时候也问了一些我的。也是汉人朋友，台湾的汉人朋友。然后其实我觉得很多人也会觉得说，好像很难直接回答卡拉宾的问题。但对我觉得这是一个initial 的一个 response。
I think that how do you say, hesitation perhaps that you described, Zian, is very normal, perhaps, and maybe part of the unease, I think, introduced not just by these questions, but the films. And it's it's a really interesting question because I don't know exactly the composition of the other people here in this room, but you are sort of forced to reflect on, well, who am I and where am I placed in this discussion, but also in relation to these films, how am I looking at them? And I don't know, that's kind of the ease or privilege perhaps that we have sometimes as maybe as either Han people or other identifications that allow us to take in these films in a somewhat distanced manner. I'm curious if anyone else felt similarly while watching the films, or even in response to the questions posed here in the pre-recorded video.
如果可以的话，我也想那个来说一些，就是我看那个卡拉宾小组的那个电影的一些感想。因为其实在上纽 ICA 这个之前，我大概有2次机会看到卡拉宾小组的这个电影。 就是应该是2年前的上双，还有就是一次在那个时代美术馆的那个一个群展当中。但是这2次相当于它给我的感觉都是一个片段，一个碎片。其实带给我的更多的是困惑，而不是这个真正的进入到他们的这个电影里面去。然后当时让我的有些困惑的就是他们使用的这个电影语言，其实让如果从那个技术上来说，他们是刻意的选择了一种非常粗糙的那个表演和剪辑的方式，然后。但是当这个背后的那个故事没有办法在一开始浮现出来的时候，这样的方式会让我有一些困惑，就是他们到底在做的这个事情是什么？那直到后面我了解了他们的背景，了解了他们这个电影背后的这些东西之后，我才觉得这样的方式反而是那个最合适于这样的电影的方式，因为它不再是一种能够被我们简单的按照我们的这种熟悉的电影工业的标准进入的。这样一种方式，反而使得那些背后的那些粗糙的、没办法被直接吸纳的那些东西浮现了出来，而这也是我对他们的电影最感兴趣的，就是并不是电影本身作为一个艺术品。它的品质，或者说它的这个艺术品的这个平面，而是它的这个电影本身作为一种行动，电影本身作为一种反抗现实的行动，以及作为一种把人们凝聚在一起，然后形成某种自我组织的这样一种能力，我会觉得他们的电影应该是在无限的放大这样一个能力。那么对于就是他们在提出来的问题，我也可能从我的角度有一些嗯比较有意思的案例，因为我自己在关注着的一个话题，是关于也是关于一个我可能得先做一下自我介绍，就是我叫陈金浩，我来自这个中国的云南。然后我的有一个这个长期的那个项目是在中国和越南边境上的一个少数族群，然后这个少数族群它非常有意思的，刚好是它是一个跨居于2个国家的人数极少的一个族群。那么在这里，卡拉宾小组提出来的这个问题，我会觉得就非常有意思，就是你怎么保有你的土地？那么对于我在关注的这个族群来说，他们的土地实际上是被划分为了2个国家，就是他们曾经住在这里，但是在某一个时刻，有一条国境线突然到来了，他们会发现2个相邻的村子一下子变成了一个村子变成了越南人，然后另外一个村子变成了中国人。然后其实在这里那个也没办法太多的展开讲，但是他们就是实际上就是开始了一种流动的这种生活，就是他们会有一些策略，如何跨过那个国境线，如何和那个其实是同一个族群，但是又变成了不同国家的这个另外一个这个村子在打交道，以及随着这个历史的进程，当2个国家的一场战争从70年代开始爆发，一直到90年代结束的时候，他们的这个土地和身份如何被这样的远超于他们这种身份的这种2个国家的这种国际事件重新塑造，就是他们的国民身份以及他们自己本身的民族身份如何在这些事件当中被重新形塑。我会觉得和那个卡拉宾小组在对比的，就是他们在关注的这个问题，可能会有一个非常有意思的对比。
Thank you so much, Xin Hao and Xian, for your comments. I was wondering if perhaps we might allow Mao Laoshi, who is another filmmaker based both here in Shanghai and Hunan, to offer his thoughts. Oh, Mao Laoshi, we can't really hear you at the moment. Okay. Then why don't we, while we're waiting to allow Mao to return, perhaps we can maybe go on to the next question, and we can always hop around, of course. Maybe one topic will inspire another response. Maybe the next question, if we could move on to that, or, oh, is Mao, can you? Okay, still not able to hear you. Okay, we'll keep trying then, and maybe ICA, my colleagues, if any of you might be able to assist Mao, if that might be helpful. So the second question that Karrabing has asked us is, do you have ancestors and totems in your country? And in the video, Cameron was actually asking more specifically, do you have totems too? And totems is kind of left up to interpretation, though I do think that for those of you who've seen the films, maybe the most direct correlation would be that of the concept of dreamings that appears throughout. So it doesn't have to be an exact connection to the dreamings or what was the equivalent of dreamings, I guess, in your respective context or country. But whatever totems may mean for you, and also this goes in part with ancestors. So the question is here is, do you have ancestors and totems in your country?
我觉得那也是其中一个我一些朋友觉得没有办法回答的问题。
I think it's kind of interesting that well, for those that have spoken up at least, that this is a tough question for us to ask. One, this relationship to land, and two, the question of totems, or whether, and feeling quite distant from these concepts. And I think maybe it would be interesting for us to interrogate why that is. If anyone has any thoughts on that.
那如果没人说，我可能就继续说一点。那个就是其实上就是在我关注的这个族群莽人，他们是有自己的图腾的。其实他们每一个人，虽然说他们都会有一个就是中国的名字，然后有一个好像是和汉人相似的一个姓，但其实他们自己是有一个有点类似于我们说的姓氏的这个氏的，就是实际上就是他们的图腾，而且每一种图腾可能都是一种在他们生活的这个区域可能有的这个动物，那么这个图腾就会给他们就是身份上会有一些区分，就是每一个不同图腾的人，他可能会有一些相应的禁忌。比如说和我最熟悉的这个一个莽人朋友，他叫盘世忠，小盘，然后他的图腾就是这个斑鸠，然后所以说他的这个凡是有他这个图腾的人，就是在打猎的时候是不能去打斑鸠的。然后那么就是这个背后呢，就会有很多的这个故事。然后这个他们其他的图腾还有包括什么，像那个小麂子，就是一种鹿。然后或者说是猫头鹰，然后或者说是这个老虎或者熊，然后他们这个每一个图腾背后就是相当于都会有一个和他们的这个民族的之前他们的来源中间的一个故事。比如说他们说麂子的那个故事，就是曾经他们是不会种地的，一直到有一天有一只会说话的麂子就拿自己的脚在这个山坡上踩下一个一个的坑，然后就把这个种子放进去了，然后就长出东西来了。他们就开始和这个麂子学了这个技能，然后于是这一波人就开始有了这样一个图腾。 那么就我自己在关注的这个范围，可能有这样一个可以分享的故事。
我现在讲话有声音吗？
Thank you, Xinhao.
有吗？
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, Mao, we can hear you.
那不好意思啊，我再接着陈清浩和喜安的那个谈一下我的感觉。那个卡拉宾的这次的电影，我看了有11部，真正看下来，我的出发点是从 Polanyi 的以前的写作开始的，因为他的很多写作，看到他的影像制作的这种具体的作品的时候，我产生了很多跟他的写作的有关的这些部分，所以我就联想到这卡拉宾电影的整个的叙述。刚才也有分享者说到了，这些作品好像乍一看很难去理解，它的场景被抽出来了，需要把它系统的或者说把它的背景呢整体的展示出来的时候，我们对于理解这个卡拉宾的制作可能会有更多帮助。但是我想到了一个词，就是像这个Polanyi 自己的写作里面所谈到的，从卡拉宾或者从把澳大利亚的这种人类学实践，特别他谈到的铜矿。当然在卡拉宾的电影中间，我看到了一个我最近很感兴趣的一个矿，叫锂矿，就是关于储备能源、关于新能源的一个概念的。这里面其实有很多跟宇宙有关的部分。其实我那个整体的把这个它的影像中间很多的这种元素做了一些排比，我发现卡拉宾的叙述是有自己的非常稳定的一个宇宙的。这不光是两个部落，或者说这种临时连接，产生了一个从08或者07年开始的这种部落式连接，通过电影这样的一种行动的意涵而产生的这种内部的这种叙事的这种方式，特别有这种 Polanyi 他们的这种介入，这中间也看到了白人，包括他自己扮演的这种非常有趣的一个白人男性的一个角色。但是我们在里面更多看到的是，这里面有几个场景空，说我们看到的灌木丛，我们就会联想到卡拉宾他们所在这个宇宙里面所分派出来的有祖先概念的、有仪式概念的这样的一个叙述部分。而且我觉得这个里面最有意思的一个关于本体论中间的一个3个要素的叙述，就是我们说到的是，沙漠、病毒还有泛理论者，这里面他们也有一些对应的一个，不能说结构框架，也是一些对应的一个词汇的区域。比如说他们会说到泥地，会对外部性的这种，无论是白人的还是现代化的，还是说定居的这种概念的，他们也有一套对应的词汇，在这个电影中间应该是非常稳定的。也不能说系统化，应该是稳定的，有非常完整的这种很严谨的一个叙述。所以我觉得，所以卡拉宾电影的整个的制作是，对我自己的这种导电影的制作来说是非常有参照意义的。就是我会在这电影中间看到了一种非常生动的一种指向，就是这种指向就是我们把电影的这种疏简的到一个方屏上的一种方式，还原到了电影中间是。有一种不光是行动的功能，更重要的可能是有一个 act， 就是有一个行动者，一个不断在生成的这样的一个角色。所以从这个而言，这个里面，这样我觉得对我自己的工作中间，我们一直在阅读今天的所谓的现代化，对我们无论是乡村还是对中国的已有的部落式社会，或者说我们的社区的较为稳定的文化的一种不能说破坏，应该是更大的一种改动。这个时候。我们就发现有一个很重要的祖先仪式，这也是在那个南美的一个人类学家，就是因为在卡斯特罗他的叙述里面有的祖先这个概念本身和仪式这个角度，好像变成了一个我们去突破这样的一个当前的一个现实中间的一个状况的时候，能选的一个让我们可以就范，就是我们可以落在这个范式里面，发现我们的生和死，只要交给了祖先。交给这种图腾本身，我们就有一个归地一样的，哪怕归地是一种在路上的过程，但是它都有一个地那种所谓的这种祖先中间的一种归属感的一种欲望。所以这个电影中间也跟Polanyi 的一种写作中间给了我最大的一个 特别应该是有提示性的一点，也就是关于仪式。仪式让很多无法解决的问题都被仪式解决掉了。所以这个电影它的很多影像中间，这个卡勒宾电影的基本上每部作品中间都有一个跟仪式、跟古老的影像、跟那种象征性的图像抵印在一起的一个解决的通道一样的，也是他们所谓的梦时光。所以我觉得，不过这个叙述，这个关于梦的叙述、梦时光这个叙述特别有意思。这我也容易联想到像那个法国哲学家贝拉斯蒂格勒的一个叙述，他认为梦是能够超越算法的机器。就今天的这个社会对我们的压抑，我们只有在梦中间才能够出反击和反抗。所以我先说这一点，因为可能比较乱。谢谢啊。
No, that was really great. Thank you, Mao. I think you brought up some really interesting questions. And I want to circle back to them eventually. Definitely the question that you're asking in terms of thinking about not just the content of the films, but what the place or the purpose of films are for us, and also thinking about concepts such as ancestors and totems, and if I understood the interpretation correctly, if it can have some kind of maybe reparative function or purpose for a group of people, at least in this room, that find it difficult to answer the question about, you know, our relationship to land and ancestors, and if we have ancestors and totems. I think it's really interesting that, I mean, when I first saw this video, when they sent it to me and the questions asked, I myself was also getting nervous because I didn't quite have answers to them myself, but it's in that affect, that feeling of unease and discomfort that I was thinking, okay, well, maybe that can lead to a productive, or not productive, but generative discussion about why that feeling of unease, that distance from these concepts like ancestor, totem, country, or land exists for us, or if it's shared. I wondered if it was shared amongst this group. So please, everyone, if you want to chime in here about that, or anything that Mao has said, please do.
我可以再分享一下，就是关于刚在谈祖先嘛，然后我觉得其实刚刚 Michelle 在讲说，我就是同样就是我刚刚一样也有的那个就是迟疑，就是到底有没有祖先，但我觉得可能最有意思的是说每个人都其实都有，但是你只不知道，我觉得是个忘记的过程嘛，然后。但其实刚刚讲到，包括 Elizabeth 她自己也去找，然后在我看的一些访谈里面，其实卡拉宾的成员就是问 Elizabeth 说，所以你的意大利白人祖先他们也有图腾吗？然后他们反正他也是说有类似的东西等等的，就我觉得其实也是一个，其实它激发的应该也是一个重新找的过程吧，然后。其实我后来觉得，就即便是汉人，然后或者即便是白人，其实你如果去用力的找，然后譬如说你去研究，譬如说纺织的历史，其实你有时候也可以找到一些，就是这个地方的人在以前他怎么样透过一些媒介，然后去有一种完全跟现在完全不一样的跟社会组织的方式。我的理解其实是说，当原住民用图腾把祖先的话，还有跟法律，还有歌谣什么东西都连接在一起的时候，其实在不同的社会，其实都会有，就即便是一个定居的农耕的社会，也会有这样的模式嘛，因为你就是其实，在古代所有的劳动都会跟歌谣有，就是有一些歌谣是，比如说纺织是用来 计算东西的。然后，所以我觉得作为汉人，你也可以想象到底你古代的那种就是你的祖母、祖母，然后他可能是做纺织，还会唱一些就是可以算那个纺织针数的歌谣的那样的形象是什么？然后其实我觉得可能也算是对于这种回应问题，还有涉及到你从哪里来的复杂性很感兴趣。然后我其实也邀请一个我的澳大利亚的朋友，他叫 Candice， 然后他今天有在，然后他是艺术家，然后他其实是马来西亚的华侨，但是他出生在澳洲，有在柏林做就是艺术的训练。但很巧的是，他前几天也在家附近做驻留，然后我家是在台湾的花莲，然后他在夏天的时候也是在台湾的就太鲁阁族的传统领地做residency， 然后反正他刚结束一个 residency， 然后也觉得就虽然他说他之前没有看那么多卡拉宾的电影，但我觉得可能是听他讲，就是他觉得那个复杂性在哪里，然后他作为艺术家怎么样认识这样的工作，因为他其实自己的艺术工作也跟土地有关，所以我也想介绍一下 Candice 在吗？
Sure, yeah, please. Oh, did you want to say something, Candice?
Okay, yeah, hi. I think Zian was mentioning my practice just then. We spoke about these questions and in relation to the work I've been doing in Taiwan with the Turuku Dali Datong community. And yeah, there's a lot to say in terms of for who I can speak, or like, yeah, I'm just gonna give you my own answers to these questions. So as Sian said, I think it's a question of actually, where are you from? So as he mentioned, my parents are from Malaysia, their parents are from Guangdong, China, and from a Hakka community. And I was born in Australia and now working in Taiwan. And yeah, I suppose I came to Taiwan wanting to learn Chinese, but as you can see, it's more comfortable speaking in English, and also getting in touch with my Chinese background. But actually, I found myself being invited to work with the Indigenous Turuku community, and that took me on a different path. Where in one hand I was trying to connect with, I suppose, like a Han Chinese background, and have actually just been redirected in a sense, or through the Dali Datong community, being able to actually just be more involved with understanding the space I'm in, the actual geography or the geology or the land that I'm staying in that way. So it's been a really interesting journey. And so, yeah, but it's always this going back and forth between, my being in Taiwan as a foreigner, but somehow connected, and reflecting on also my identity in Australia as from an immigrant family. And then also reflecting on what I know about Australian indigeneity with Taiwanese indigeneity. And yeah. So yeah, but
Oh no, I was just gonna say continue, or if you want to stop, it's fine.
Maybe I can ask some question to Candice, but potentially to, I guess, all of the participants in this chat room, because what I'm interested in witnessing, having Karrabing showing in Shanghai, but there's also on program, right? So I guess what's interesting is this uneven distribution of interest into the notion of land and the care of land and indigeneity in different parts of the Chinese-speaking lands. For example, what we have in Taiwan recently is a boom in contemporary art of having all this sudden interest in indigeneity in Taiwan, which I'm sure Candice has also kind of involved as a guest. And in this process, you also notice that quite often there are different, for example, the Southeast Asian curators working with Taiwanese indigenous artists as a kind of an alternative to, say, Han Chinese Taiwanese curators curating indigenous Taiwanese artists. So I guess in this, there's this kind of a interesting ways of evolving, and it's actually depending on the historical and geographical condition of the place. Whereas in China, the new, like, I got lots of like mainland Chinese friends keep introducing me of new generations of Taiwanese indigenous writers and artists, and I just acquire quite a few books from their recommendations. So I guess that also means there's a new kind of, there's emerging audience base in mainland China that is interested in the alternative ways of organizing land in Chinese-speaking territories, right? So that's very interesting, because that actually represents different mindsets and different sets of aesthetic values that is not prioritizing, for example, formalism in art. They might be more interested into relational aesthetics, for example, and they want to know more about what is, like, how does the society organized, and how is it possible to organize the aesthetic and society differently from what we know right now. So I guess it's a way to kind of restructure the sense of time and the sense of art and land and people. So I guess that for me is what's interesting, to kind of get to know, okay, who is interested in Karrabing, and by that I might be able to kind of, identify a more audience base that is interested in the new kind of emerging paradigm, which I'm sure if you look into what the latest versions of Documenta, the curators decided to retreat from, in their selections of Chinese and Taiwanese artists, you kind of witness there's this decisive shift of interest from what we are already, those artists who's interested in formalities, into those artists who is more interested into a relationship with land and convivialities and the sense of commons and communities. So I guess this is more of an open question to kind of to kind of push people to speak up, I guess, and to say something more about how do you understand this kind of paradigm, or how do you understand this like chemistry in relation to indigeneity.
Yeah, maybe I can just answer in terms of the project that I've been doing. Yeah, okay. So the community that I was working with, I've been working with in Taiwan, is actually a community that has at one point been encouraged to leave the Karrabing National Park. And so in terms of that claim to land, and the use of that land is always very contested and conflicted. And so in my project, I was actually wanting, sorry, my microphone's gonna cut out in a second. But I was going to garden with the community. I'm hoping to learn about their use of their traditional farming practices and how they make use of the land. And basically, what I learned is that this year is that the Karrabing have a right to use the land, but not own the land in a way. So it's very much based on like your ability to work with the land and what you're doing with it. From what I have gauged, and also so in that space of working with the land, there was also like a very hesitant cooperation of me farming with them, with the land. So I think these were all interesting things that came up. But yeah, I don't know if that answers anything, but.
No, I think I thank you so much for sharing your projects and practice, Candice, and Zian for posing that question, because I think you touched upon something interesting about the uneven distribution of I guess, whether it's cultural production, knowledge production, or one's relationship on a personal level to things like the notion of land and indigeneity and Sino media culture sphere of sorts. But then also the second layer to that is how that movement or emergence or unevenness is then represented in like a global kind of so-called global platform or forum like Document Castle, which is, you know, this thing that happens every 5 years and is supposed to sort of be this culmination or snapshot of you know, what's going on and what's important to the contemporary art world at that time or in this moment. So of course, like we can continue to talk about that and have that be part of our broader conversation. I do feel a bit obligated to just run through some of the other questions, which I think we've been talking about this whole time, but if we could just move to the next slide, and I think Candice was referring to this as well. This question of how do you manage your traditional lands? That was how they phrased it on the screen. And then I believe Cameron also asked, though, in vernacular terms, but it's interesting the choice of words, like managing land versus looking after land. Are these two different things? Are they the same? I'm curious how people would respond to this, or if it's again a big question mark, because we don't know how we would answer this if we don't even have a concept of what our traditional lands are, or if the management of those lands is much more straightforward. Well, we manage them through property ownership and through development and through government regulation of, you know, plots and properties and and so forth. So yeah, how do you manage your traditional lands, and or how do you guys look after your land? It seems like Mao wanted to answer this question.
是我连第一个问题我刚才忘记回答，其实第一个问题我先补充一下，就是问到了他问到我们的国家的这种图腾，其实就像卡拉宾的这些部落，他们会说我们要回到我们的国家，这个理解一样的，就是我们中国有大量的少数族群，包括一些局部的居住区域，他们的内部认同也是国家，所以我们不能够放在一个这样的大的所谓中国的概念上去理解这种图腾这样的概念。我2007年开始在贵州的黔东南地区的人类学的电影制作中间，涉及的全都是类似于区分于我们的汉语、大汉语的这种小语种化的这种国家，很多苗族它内部还有很多细小的分支，但是呢，他们的这种认同感、内部的认同感都有非常区分化的一种关系，就是说这个部落和那个部落中间呢，同一个我们的这个国家民族管理中间所属的苗族中间也会有很多细的区分，包括侗族也有，应该是很多完全不一样的，有很多大量的侗族的寨子是不具备，就比如说大家知道的那种，侗族要有一个很高的这种鼓楼啊，还有一个很好的风雨桥的设施，但是据我调查的村落就有一个非常好的村庄，它就是侗族，但是它从不设风雨桥，但是它有一个水塘，一个很小的蓄水池作为它的图腾，作为它的施咒或者说所有的仪式的一个发生地。所以这个里面的很多叙述，如果放在国家这个概念，可能我们把它缩小成放在某种区块里面去讨论的时候，它的空间会比较有张力。而且我也认为我的村庄13户人家组成的细毛家屋场，它有自己的宇宙，它也有它自己的图腾。比如说一只老虎，那老虎曾经袭击过村庄，那我认为它的这种内部的禁忌中间，到底它这个不能从一个非常稳定的长时间的这种祖先的这种5000代，还是说1000代，还是多少年的关系里面去寻找这样的一个今天的回忆。还有我觉得也是不是在一些现代的一些，比如说像非常偏远的地方，我2003年做的项目是湖北的神农架地区的就是原始森林里面，其实它就是一种非常中心化的汉语区，那里也不一定是图腾，它还是唐代以来流传的笔记本小说的东西。但是在一些非常像 smart 区，可能有一些小的社区里面、小的社群里面，这些自发的组织里面，它可能也有一种图腾的概念在的。所以我觉得这个问题就是，如果用国家的角度去理解我们中国的大量的很多区域，应该是刚才陈希浩也说到了云南和这越南边境，还有我所看的这个吃水稻的区域里面，有数不清的图腾的叙述，而且它是一个网络，它在每一个村庄里面都有一个境界，包括我们理解了侗族、理解苗族中间，比如说咒语的关系里面，还有一种非常完整绵密的内部性很扎实的一个叙事网络。这是一个。第二个就是说，我觉得传统土地也是有的。我的记忆中间，我们的土地的管理中间，我们的一层这么大的人身体这么大的一层茅草，都有非常明确的边界，是属于这个村落的，还是属于那个村落的。所以到底什么时候我们开始出现了一种有效的记忆，去把土地跟邻邦之间的关系去区分开来？就像那个卡拉宾电影中间有一部关于，就是由彭雷里自己扮演那个钓鱼的那个白人杰克的时候，说我在咸水上。然后这边的反应就是你有本事到我的土地上来，到我的国家上来。所以我们也看到了边界的区分很微妙，很有意思，就是说它的叙述在我们的村落之间很有意思。然后呢，我也讲一个跟台湾，因为喜安他们也是台湾的这种关系，我们的村庄在建高速公路的时候发生了一起跟我们的政治关系有关的一种争论，这中间又涉及到国和土地的关系。有2个同一个姓氏的2个家族，有一个哥哥很大了，他在1949年的时候移居了台湾，他在台湾有19个孩子，是孙子，第4代人。但是这个时候家里面建高速公路要拆分了，土地的关系虽然建立了新的国家的土地制度，但是分配的时候还是按照族谱来分的。这个时候，如果你这个另外一家人说他们是台湾人，他们是曾经的意思是叛国者，被驱逐的， 他们不能够作为受益的对象，但是对方这个变成了一个两岸的政治关系，但是这边负责自己的哥哥一次9个人定的分配，因为数额极为巨大，对农民来说很大啊，一人可能会达到数万人民币。所以如果你认为中国和台湾不是一家的话，你就把钱不要给我们，所以变成了两岸政治关系的这种扯到了一个非常大的宏大的话题里面去，以至于官司没法结案这样的一个过程。所以我也看到了，就是在很多细小的区域里面的连接的历史的，还有很多我们看到的是一代一代人的这种像记忆一样的，都在不断的在修改，因为人的关系啊出现了很多操作，所以中间也不是有稳定的这种全序性，一直都在修改的过程。OK。
Thank you, Mao. I thought actually that's really interesting to think about, especially in relation to what Xian said earlier about needing to do the work or the labor of discovery in terms of one's sort of ancestry or history and relationship to land, and that definitely brings up just more questions for me personally. But I think Man Kun, did you want to raise a question you mentioned in the chat?
我用中文说，就是我想图腾这个问题，其实在陈信浩还有毛老师的分享里面，它变成了一个，就是好像变成了一个划分中国少数民族和汉族和土地之间关系的不同模式的一条分水岭，或者是一个关键词。我想问的其实是毛老师还有陈信浩会不会觉得汉人跟中国的少数民族，如果就是拿其他地方的原住民来做坐标的话，汉族会相对离那种非现代性的模式远一点，然后中国少数民族会离那种模式近一点，是不是本质上汉人是一种更加现代性的构造，然后对，然后我想就是这个问题它背后的台词是因为我们知道中国少数民族政策其实是就是用一种类似于种族主义的方式去划分了汉人跟其他民族的在这个土地上的民族的人嘛。然后如果我们这样想，就是用二元主义的区分方式去想汉人跟土地的关系和少数民族跟土地的关系的话，会不会重复这种现代国家的一套语言系统？不知道有没有问清楚。好，问完了。
其实是我们在顺着第一个问题，刚才这个卡拉宾小组的那个问题，我来假设一下，我们放在一个他所叙述的带有一个区块的部落的一个领地的角度去作为国家的，我觉得这个理解应该是在我们既有的叙述，比如说包括德勒兹和瓜达里的叙述前高原里面是肯定性的，这就是原始部落的这种概念方式就是国家装置，所以我就觉得放在这个今天的这个刚才的经济环境里面，我也还是觉得我们的这种关注的对象中间的区块化，包括我也认为我们的村庄或者是我们很小的一个流域里面的这种较为具有地方方言的一种特征或者小语种区域里面，它也存在一种类似于国家这样的概念。所以我所理解的国家可能更多是类似于是比较的接近是领地跟已有的栖居中间有关系的。那这样的话，我也可以反问另外一个问题，可能也是今天的 Pauline 他们的研究的一个方向，就是我们的洞庭湖区域在1949年之后进行了洞庭湖的大面积的围湖造田，这时候就多出了一些人，这些人从各个有建水库的地方，整个建了一个超大型的水库建在山顶上，然后那个里面的原住民全部应该也叫原住民啊，无论他是什么样的人民聚集在那个状态的，被统一的移到了这个洞庭湖的福州，也就是说洞庭湖的浮床的基础上围建起来的区域。但是长期以来，他们在经历了应该是3代人以上，经常会失去他们对于土地的标识，因为它会被洪水淹没，然后永远失去了边界。他们 只知道我们的土地是在那个水下面的，在洪水下面的。所以我觉得我也是看卡拉宾的这个叙述的时候，突出了我们的生态的连接性，就是我们理解的这种边界生态，以及我们跟所有的所谓的外部性的这种国家装置，当这个国家装置具有统治性的这个概念的时候，我们又如何去安置我们这种叙述的这种方式。好的，我可能有点说杂了，但是我觉得这个话题是跟我看卡拉宾的电影制作中间，他们也有无意中间提到了这样的一种关系，比如说有毒的，不管来自白人的，可能也来自于。
那我也接着毛老师的，就是我也想那个回应一下曼坤刚才说的那个问题。就我会觉得这个问题其实是非常重要的，就是当我们在进行划分的时候，实际上就已经是在强调一种在这个划分背后的那套逻辑了。那么就是如果说这个说到那个汉人和非汉人这个少数民族，或者甚至用了少数民族这个词的时候，其实上就已经默认有一个majority 就是在那里存在了，而这些少数民族不管是从这个力量上来说，还是从数量上来说，它就是一个 minority。但是呢，我在这里我想强调的是，其实这样的身份的划分，它一定得被看作是一个流动的，而不是说是一个这个与生俱来的，按照血缘就一直以来存在的。那么就是还是回到我自己熟悉的这一个区域，就比如说云南，其实在云南这个多数和少数这个从历史上来说就是一个非常重要的问题。就是我们当然今天会说这个云南有很多的少数民族，这个一共有这个26个少数民族，然后以及汉族，但是这些少数民族其实是在这个在明朝之后，它才成为了少数民族。因为在明朝之前，汉族在这里本身就是少数民族。然后，但是当这个明朝这个占据了云南之后，他们实际上在做的一件事情就是使得云南汉地化或者说内中国化。那么他们在做的一个非常重要的这个举措，就是从这个江浙一带不断的迁移汉人的这个民户到云南的滇中。然后以使得这个汉人在云南成为了绝对的多数。那么他们大概估算了一下，这个整个明朝，大概200多年、300年的时间，然后这个迁移到这个云南的这个汉族的人口，可能保守的估计是150万，然后有最大胆的估计说可能有超过300万。然后就这个150万或者300万的这个汉人，就直接制造出来了云南的少数民族。这个是一方面，就是多数和少数的这样的一个变化。还有另外一方面，就是民族本身的这个自我认同的这个身份的变化，它也不是一直以来就是一种持续不变的。那么这里可能想分享一个这个例子，就是在云南有一个少数民族叫做拉祜族。拉祜族在那个建国之前，它是叫做裸黑，就是一个少数民族了。那么裸黑它其实是居住在云南的山地，就是云南哀牢山，然后往南往西的这样一片山地当中。那么以前当汉人没有大量存在的时候，那么他们就基本上是控制了这个山地和山地上的所有的这个传统的土地、森林资源，包括着这个盐井和茶。但是当汉人越来越多的涌入之后，这些重要的这个资源就逐渐被汉人控制，逐渐被官府收归控制，而他们就开始这个就相当于就是用汉人的技术来说，就是这些少数民族开始造反了。那实际上你可以想象，就是当汉人一波一波的涌入，挤占了他们传统的生存空间之后，他们唯一能够做的反抗就是这样的造反或者说起义。那么起义伴随着就是被镇压，那么清朝的政府就相当于试图把他们驱赶出云南。那么当时云南的边界，他们认为的云南的边界其实就是澜沧江。所以这些造反的茶农，或者说因为这个盐井被官方控制之后造反的这些人群，就被逐渐一波一波的赶到了澜沧江的西边。在这个时候，共享了这段记忆的人，最后都自称自己是裸黑，就是今天的拉祜。但其实上这波人他并不是原来的那一波清朝政府说成是裸黑的那批族群。 就是它有一部分是曾经的裸黑，还有一部分是什么苦聪人，还有一部分甚至就是汉族人。但是当他们共享了这样一个集体的记忆，共享了说我们曾经的家是在澜沧江的东边，他们死之后的这个毕摩，他们的这个巫师要把他们的魂魄指回家，是要指到澜沧江的东边去。然后共享了所有这些记忆的人，他最后就自称自己就是裸黑，然后最后就被定名为拉祜。然后因为裸黑是一个贬义的这个称呼，然后拉祜这两个字看上去好看一些。那么在这个49年、50年代的这个民族识别当中，他们就通通被叫做了拉祜族。那么我会觉得，在这里其实我们需要非常具体的去看每一片土地和每一个族群的这种微观的历史。而如果简单的再说汉族和非汉族，说是甚至说用其他的方法来划分是，比如说斯科特的这个谷地国家还是山地民族，我会觉得就可能都是一些会存在问题的。那么可能具体到这样一次一次的具体的历史的事件，他们如何对历史事件进行叙说，他们如何去处理自己和那个具体的土地的关系的时候，我会觉得很多那个通过贴上这样的大的标签所无法解决的那些细小的问题，才可能会浮现到水面上。
我补充一个点，就是从我们的东部沿海、福建、浙江，一直到这个广东的区域里面，有一个所谓的少数民族的统称，叫畲族。就是畲这个词的原汉语意思就是刀耕火种，所以这个族群的认同是来自于他们的居住状况，比如说依照山体，具有一种怎么说，正有一种跟农耕平育啊，或者是山地这个耕种，还有别的一种类似于较为陡峭的这种山坡为耕种特征的这样的一种归类。所以这个也是在包括从这个纬度而言，从福建一直到贵州和云南的这种甘南式建筑的样式里面，它跟纬度有关的这种建造样式，可能也是跟气候有关的这种样式里面，也连接了一种因为居住空间啊带来的一种认知方式的一种，也不能说是相似性，就补充这个。
We're kind of closing out on time here, so I just want to take this moment to ask if there's anyone that we haven't heard from over the last hour that perhaps wants to share their thoughts or a question for the rest of the evening. Okay, well, I thought there'd be one more comment from someone, but if I think, you know, there were a couple more slides that came, or sorry, questions that came up. If Danny, you could just help us review what the questions were. I think the next question was about traditional rights to own your land and keep it from being stolen, which I think we sort of touched upon indirectly in our discussion. And then the last question was about how you relate to state or government desires for your traditional land, which again, I think was sort of loosely pointed to in a number of different ways throughout our discussion. So my hope is here that, you know, everything we've done today in this past hour will prove interesting and generative in this exchange with the artists, and perhaps you know, help continue to enact the kinds of diversions that Karrabing tries to do with their filmmaking, not only the production but the circulation of their work in many different places. I mentioned at the beginning of our event that we would take a poll just to get a sense of how people feel about publishing this recording. So I'll just remind everyone that typically when we have a public program at the ICA. We record the event, we transcribe, translate it into English or Chinese and subtitle the videos, and then we publish them online as part of the ICA's online media archive. So that finds its way onto mainstream platforms such as YouTube, but also Chinese platforms such as the Center for Experimental Film, or sometimes Tencent or Bilibili. So with that in mind, we're going to take a poll asking if whether the majority here prefers that the recording of today's event be published or not published. And just one iteration, one disclaimer I want to remind everyone is that the recording will be shared with Karrabing Film Collective, whether or not we choose to publish it here today. So if you want to publish, then it'll be published widely online. And if you choose not to publish, then we'll only share it with the artist after today. So please feel free to answer the poll, and we'll publish the results after everyone's participated. And we'll get the results of the poll as soon as most everyone has answered the question. Yes, and I thank you, Iris, for reminding everyone. The poll is anonymous, so what your answer is to this question will not be recorded. Okay, so well, it depends on your perspective. The majority of you have chosen to publish this video, while 13% of respondents have chosen not to publish. So this means that we will publish today's documentation of the discussion on the ICA Media Archive. If you have any questions about this process or the protocol, please feel free to email us at our email address, which we'll put in the chat. It's shanghai.ica@nyu.edu. And this will take several months for us to go through this process, but please feel free to inquire in the meantime before it is. I just want to thank everyone. Well, first I want to say thank you to Karrabing for proposing and engaging with us in this unusual format, which was a proposal actually from the ICA. And I'm also grateful to the ICA team, my colleagues, Iris Zhu, Yang Bao, Danny Wang, and Ellen Gu, for helping to organize and support this event. And I'm also very grateful to our interpreters, Heather and Francis, for so deftly assisting us to communicate across languages today. And thank you all who came here on a Saturday to really join and participate in a discussion that may not have been so easy, but I hope it was interesting and generative for all. So we hope that you'll join us for other programs in the near future, and please be in touch. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.